1st of March 2020, I discovered my body paralysed from head to toe. In the intensive care unit, unable to open my eyes, move, nor breathe for myself, I lay conscious in a coma. This suicide attempt was the closest that I've been to death. I had to be resuscitated. My heart restarted. I was brought back from the brink, you might say. Years of pain and psychological suffering tortured me every second of every day, inflating and weighing me down like a giant lead balloon. Too often, this balloon would get so big that it burst, releasing thousands of painful shards, shattering not only my life, but the lives of the people around me too. At the age of 15, I was sectioned under the Mental Health Act for the first time, detained in hospital against my will. Little did I know this was just the start of a tornado of trauma, over-medication and mistreatment in the name of psychiatric care that would haunt me for the rest of my teenage years. I had spent 6 of my 22 years of life within the 4 walls of hospitals. The trauma that I endured whilst there commenced a catastrophic cascade of further mental illness to brew in my brain. I ended up with diagnoses of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, borderline personality disorder, anorexia nervosa, and well, the list goes on. The complex nature of these diagnoses left me being deemed untreatable, resistant, a lost cause. It wasn't just me who had lost hope, the professionals had too. I was bullied, belittled, and punished behind the 4 walls of psychiatric hospitals. Handcuffs cutting away at desperate wrists. The diminuendo of screams whilst being held down, injected, sedated. No saw from nasogastric feeding tubes being violently inserted. Sirens wailing as I looked down to see my legs trembling on the edge of a bridge. The monotonous beat of life support machinery. And worst of all, the absolute terror in my parents' faces. It all replayed in my head. I think back to my therapy sessions in hospital, draped in rip-proof clothing with 2 weeks of unbrushed hair, painfully trying to construct a list of reasons why life is worth living. Most of these sessions ended in heavy restraint and injections. I was so desperate to die, I was convinced that no, my life would never be worth living. I lived an idyllic early childhood. My 3 siblings and I were born in London and raised by 2 loving parents. We lived in a beautiful top-floor apartment with far-reaching views over the city. My time there was filled with glorious memories, from the birth of my siblings to long walks along the Thames. After 3 cats, a new house, and another baby girl joining the family a few years later, we all moved to Dubai. It was an incredible experience. We were in our own little haven with a swimming pool, beach, ice cream shop and gardens, all within walking distance. Blue skies and temperatures of over 30 degrees every day. It was like stepping into an entirely different universe. After 2 blissful years, it was time to return to the UK, where we settled down in a small village in the south of England. I flinch, picturing how perfect, peaceful and positive the environment in which I grew up in was. How on earth did things manage to take such a catastrophic turn later in my life? But that's the thing about mental illness. It doesn't discriminate. It has the potential to affect all types of people from different backgrounds, upbringings, races, religions, genders and ages, and there is no way of predicting when or where it is going to happen. On returning from the village power service on Christmas Eve of 2010, we discovered our family home had been broken into. In less than a second, from everything being fine, the burglary became the root of my serious anxiety that reared its head as I got over. A certain amount of anxiety after the burglary was expected, but no one anticipated how deep to my core it had eaten away. I tried my best to suppress the intense feelings, to mask a brave face and continue as I always had done before. But as John Green famously wrote, The thing about pain is that it demands to be felt. And indeed, a few years later, I most definitely felt it. It started with the bullying, which drove me out of 2 secondary schools in the space of less than 6 months. I was sexually harassed often and hailed with verbal insults. I felt so out of place among my peers and my confidence faltered. The combination took an enormous toll on my increasing anxiety, but settling into my third and final school, I finally felt like I wasn't trying to squirm into a mould that wasn't quite right for me. Focusing on my studies and becoming a high-performance athlete helped me muddle through my constant and changing identity. Unfortunately, the theory of this didn't quite match the reality, and as I continued putting pressure on myself, both academically and athletically, I was beginning to break. I suddenly started having panic attacks. Multiple hour-long episodes of hyperventilating, sobbing, shaking and hallucinating every single day. It rapidly progressed into panic disorder, where the anxiety and fear of having a panic attack just causes more of them to happen. It was all-consuming, exhausting, and the disruption caused by my distress often meant that I was sent home from school. Initially, the NHS's mental health service refused to see me, seemingly waiting for things to get worse before intervention was warranted. Unfortunately, it wasn't long before the panic attacks turned into hallucinations, psychosis, depression and suicidality. But by this point, the input they offered was too little too late. Their first response was medication, but this wasn't managed properly and things continued to get worse. The suicide attempts and self-harm became unmanageable. Hospital stays and being sectioned was suddenly my reality. To this day, I strongly believe that a poorly structured system and lack of effective treatment pathway before hospital is required were the reasons I became so unwell. Treatment options shouldn't be limited by postcode. With graphical inequality drastically affecting funding allocations of mental health services across the UK, access to help needs to be available for all and in all parts of the country. The initial dismissal of mental health services meant by the time they eventually offered me help, I was too ill to accept it. Sometimes I wonder if things would have turned out differently if I was offered therapy before I was given medication. Treatment didn't seem to be the priority to them, but rather containment. The broken system's effect on me didn't stop there, and within hospital, things went even further downhill. After being in their care for a year, I was diagnosed with anorexia nervosa and force-fed through a tube that went down my nose and into my stomach. I was given the wrong medications at the wrong times, and I was often being pumped full of drugs just to sedate me. I was experiencing trauma upon trauma at the hands of psychiatrists, nurses, support workers, security, and even the police. I was kicked and beaten by staff, manipulated and coerced. The neglect for my safety meant that I was even raped by another patient. Being detained against my will meant that my voice was unheard. No one listened when I tried speaking up about all that was happening to me. I was given a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, an illness characterised by intense mood swings and extreme emotional sensitivity. To my surprise, this label actually carried more stigma among some psychiatrists than it did the general public. They used it against me and took advantage of their power. Miles away from home and my family, I was left to fend for myself. I'm not denying how vital risk management is within the setting of psychiatry. The measures that can be in place aren't nice. No one enjoys being in a rip-proof hospital gown, in an empty room with just a prison mattress, or being held onto by two nurses at all times to stop you hurting yourself. But I accept these are sometimes necessary precautions. What I will never accept is the abusive or inappropriate treatment in the name of patient safety, or the establishment of an environment where people are made to feel inferior. Bullying vulnerable individuals is fundamentally wrong, and it shocks me to my core that it is still happening today. Even with this degree of apparent risk management, My wrist herself certainly fell through the gaps at times. The severity of my self-harming behaviour became somewhat normalised. I was stuck in a toxic, repetitive cycle of hurting myself, being taken into hospital, having surgery to fix the damage from what I'd done, and then as soon as I woke up, I would run away from the two nurses next to my bed, only to hurt myself again and be brought back by the police for yet another surgery, and the cycle repeating itself. Even whilst being detained under the Mental Health Act on psychiatric wards, the cycle persisted. The surgeons were convinced that I wasn't going to survive the next operation, yet the mental health team struggled to put a stop to it. The corruption was as clear as day, but there was nothing that anyone could do. There seemed to be no remorse when the consequences of these supposed professionals' actions almost resulted in my death. It was as though they just didn't want me on their hands anymore. There were times when members of the public would take on the responsibility of keeping me alive, wrestling me off the motorway of busy traffic or bear hugging me on the edge of a railway bridge. There are so many beautifully caring souls out there who care more about my life than the people who were paid to do so. I was rapidly slipping through the net. A common theme emerged among my first few admissions. No one was confident in managing complex psychological symptoms. I was often sent home when a ward didn't know how to manage me, usually resulting in the police bringing me back because my risk was so high. It was supposedly a punitive measure, but clearly didn't work. Particularly among adolescents, when the brain is still developing, mental health symptoms don't always fit into one distinct box. A solid, isolated diagnosis can be difficult to give, but that doesn't mean that treatment should be limited. Rather than criminalisation of symptoms and distress, a therapeutic approach coded in understanding is crucial. During my long stay in hospital, amidst transfers between wards and changes in care teams, a light appeared in the extremely bleak darkness. I was offered a solicitor. It is the right of anyone detained under the Mental Health Act to have access to a solicitor, but unfairly, some units promote it more than others. It needs to be a more commonly known right, as often patients can be too unwell to fight their own corner, and without my solicitor, I don't know if I'd still be here today. My parents' unwavering support and my solicitor's commitment to my case meant that there was finally hope that I could make it out of this system alive. It wasn't until I moved to a specialist rehabilitation unit 4 years after my first admission that I finally realised how mental health workers should behave. My eyes were opened to a kindness that I can only relate to that of a family member. I was soon taught that life wasn't meant to be an endless cycle of re-traumatisation. The complexity of my symptoms and diagnoses was suddenly accepted and investigated. They saw me as a person who'd been through an awful lot of trauma and suffering, but still deep down, just a person. Just a girl with washed away dreams. They took it upon themselves to recarve those dreams and help me rebuild myself to be able to reach them. Many psychiatrists refuse to treat a dual diagnosis of an eating disorder and personality disorder. However, this unit was purpose-built to do just that. I was taught that the trauma I endured was not my fault. Rather than punishing me for being complex and treating me like a criminal, staff took the approach of breaking things down, working out what the specific issues were, what caused them, and most importantly, what can be done to improve them. During the hundreds of hours of hard work and commitment, my medication was changed, I was offered regular therapy, had a stable support system, and more than anything else, I felt loved again. Love from not only my family and friends, but from the healthcare workers, the other patients, my therapists. I hadn't experienced an emotion so positive in years. Day by day, I rebuilt the life I once had, and day by day, things got better. I got back on the tennis court, I went back to college, I applied for university, spent more time with my family, and started living, not just surviving. Don't be mistaken, I've had setback after setback, There have been times when I've reverted to believing that there really was no hope. But when I've not been strong enough to hold myself up, the extraordinary people around me have. On the 23rd of January 2023, I was discharged from hospital, having spent the last 6 years sectioned in them. I no longer need a feeding tube. I'm able to keep myself safe. I don't need someone watching me every second of every day, and I'm ready to move on. Every day, I wake up, and I choose to live. I muddle through the path that takes me through my life, constantly rerouting to steer closer to what is best for me. Literal blood, sweat and tears have led me here, along with a hell of a lot of hard work and determination. I've made it out of hospital. I've made it to university. And I've even made it onto this stage, all of which are things I never believed would be possible to do. In March 2020, existing was not something I saw as being feasible anymore. The only direction I saw out was, well, out. Oh, how I wish I could go back and tell that 18-year-old girl that self-destruction would never achieve peace or rid her of the pain. The only true way out was, in fact, by wading right through. I lived through the darkness, I learned from the darkness, and I survived the darkness. I made it. I made it back from the brink.